Yeah! Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Wow, You Made That podcast. A podcast about making stuff. A podcast about how we used to make stuff. We're talking about the entertainment industry, but not exclusively. There are a lot of skilled people, craftspeople in the creative world making amazing stuff that you've never heard of, that you've never seen, but you should. That's what this podcast is all about, and we're going to talk about it right now on Wow, You Made That. This episode's guest is a good friend of mine, a longtime friend, George Willis. He's done miniature effects work and props for over 3 decades. Let's get into it with him. Here we go. Thank you for tuning in. I'm with a longtime friend and colleague, George Willis, who I've worked with in the industry for how long now? Almost 30 years?
Yeah, it's coming up on 30 years.
That's awesome. And we'll get some of the fun stuff out of the way right away. So you also are semi-famous on reality TV for the 2nd season of The Colony. Tell us briefly, if you can, about that.
The Colony was a survival, sort of a hybrid survival and building show on the Discovery Channel. It only ran for 2 seasons. They canceled after the 2nd season, which was the season that I was on, because so many people were injured in the course of the show, mainly among the camera crews. We were running around in a lot of wreckage of Hurricane Katrina, and we just had to live for 2 months off the grid with very little outside contact or support, and just to add to the stress levels. And they always up the ante on a sequel or a 2nd season, but occasionally they would send in gangs of actors dressed as apocalypse survivors to break our stuff and steal our food, and
infamously.
Oh, and
you were sprayed. One of my favorite scenes in the series.
I and several other of my my cast members were pepper sprayed at one point. They tried to use as many non-lethal weapons against us as possible.
Okay.
One guy got chased with a taser and shot with a net gun, and lots of beating and dragging
and it was a good time.
It was not really a good time. Maybe 5% of it was fun, and about another 5% of it was horrible, and most of the time it was just miserable. You're just gathering water and filtering it and boiling it every day. Yeah, we ate pretty much every swamp animal you could find. Nutria rats, lizards, turtles.
All right, that's the highlight of
lots of snakes.
George has done other shows, but that's his main reality gig that I'm aware of. So how long have we known each other? How long would you say?
It was probably after
early 90s.
Yeah, it was
Stetson.
Yeah, Stetson Visual Services. I'm trying to remember. I don't think you worked on Edward Scissorhands.
No, I was right after that.
So Gremlins, maybe. Were you there for Gremlins?
I came in literally as you guys were wrapping that up. Gremlins too.
Okay, so what was your first job at Stetson?
It's such a blur now. I think it was at Stop Motion Orchid Man.
Oh, right, the Exterminator.
Yeah.
Yes, Orkin had a long-running ad campaign. The Orkin Exterminator Company had an ad campaign with a guy in a sort of powered armor suit that would come in, and there was a lot of special effects of lasers and things shooting out of his hands that would kill the bugs in the hiding in the walls of the building. And they're evidently basically the business for the company doubled practically overnight when they ran that ad campaign.
That was a good gig for me too. I was happy to be at Stetson's. So that was a long time ago. And but you famously like to say that you didn't pay too much attention to me early on until I showed up at one of your screenings for one of your independent films.
The first independent film I worked on was one called Alien Beach Party Massacre, and it was just a lot of friends of mine from high school. Most of my best friends from high school moved to Los Angeles and got jobs in the film industry for some reason.
How did you end up in Hollywood?
Well, I studied theater in college, and then after I graduated, two friends of mine from high school were moving to LA to get an apartment, and I just went with them, and we got a 3-bedroom.
But you were only coming up from Carlsbad.
Yeah, I was coming up from North San Diego County, so it was only about an hour and a half away. Right. So when I said, "Mom, I'm going to Hollywood," and she said, well, will you be back for dinner? And I still used to do my laundry at my parents' house, like well into my 30s. And so I moved to LA.
But you were always into building. I mean, I remember you've told me stories that when you were in high school, you were involved with the theater and you did a lot of props for them.
Yeah, the first show I ever worked on was a high school murder mystery, and my first job on that was doing special effects, and I made a pair of scissors that was sticking out of the butler's back, and he comes staggering into the scene, and they think he's drunk, and then he falls over, and everyone sees the scissors sticking out of his back. And I remember on opening night hearing a girl in the audience scream when she saw the scissors, and I remember just thinking, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do for a living.
So you went to Hollywood, and what kind of work in the industry do you do in general all these years? What have you done?
Well, I've done a lot of full-size sets and hand props and robot suits and things like that. But the vast majority of my work over the years has been miniature effects. Right. For the longest time, they used miniatures for commercials and short films and music videos. I worked on a miniature alley scene with a loading dock with a bunch of music instrument cases on it, which was for a Rush album cover back when they had LP records. Oh. So yeah, they used to use miniatures for just about everything.
Yeah, you're dating us now.
Exactly.
So you've done a lot. You've done this, 30-something years?
My first job was on Halloween Day in 1986.
Wow.
And another, give an idea how much it was dating, I was making a miniature hedge maze, sort of like the hedge maze in The Shining.
Right.
It's about 3 feet square. And this was for a Virginia Slims cigarettes magazine ad.
Right.
So it was, back when they still had advertisements in magazines for cigarettes.
So you've done a lot. You've done it all. You've done miniatures, mold making, sets, props. You've album covers, movies, TV, internet, commercials.
But like I said, miniatures have always been kind of my forte and the thing I'm most comfortable with, and that I just enjoy the most. Growing up, I worked for my father, who was a jeweler, and he had a small jewelry shop where he made all of the jewelry that he sold. And pretty much from the age of 12, he was teaching me the business, and I would be sitting at a workbench all day working with little tools, which is pretty much identical to the job I have now, which, they'd assign you something and you figure it'll take an hour or two to do that, and you make it, and then you hand it off and they give you something else. It's just that in that case, it was, soldering a ring or something.
When I was head of the model shop for the Box Trolls, there was a lot of metal work in that movie, miniature metal work, and I would throw it to one of two people. It was either George or our good friend Keith McQueen. Both of them come from a jewelry background, and no one else could pull some of that stuff off. It was really great.
It's definitely an acquired skill.
Yeah. Now, your resume is too long to mention everything, but so pull out a couple movies or projects that you worked on that you're particularly proud of. Now, you don't have to be award-winning or that great, but just stuff that you were happy and proud to work on.
Well, two of the ones that I really enjoyed working on and that came out really well that people would remember were Apollo 13 and Titanic. And one of the things that was really fun about working on those shows was that we weren't really dealing with art department drawings or any sort of production design, because the miniatures we were making weren't stylized at all. Right. They just gave us a stack of old photos and books, with pictures of the Titanic or Apollo 13, and they even gave us the blueprints to the Titanic.
Right.
And they had, these NASA blueprints and diagrams of the Apollo rockets. And we would literally just say, oh, this, retro rocket, or this, hatch cover right here looks like, in this photo, it's, about 20 inches wide. So that would mean that this porthole next to it, we would just scale it out, and that would be about 10 inches wide. And we literally just took it straight off the drawings and just reduced it to 1/20th scale.
It's nice not to deal with those pesky art directors.
Well, no, there were plenty of interesting designs in the rest of the film. I mean, of the apartments and the 1960s scenes in Cocoa Beach, Florida and stuff, but just in general, it was just very easy. There were never really any changes made along the way, because a lot of times when you're, working with a more, creative crew, where they're production designers, they're trying to establish a specific look for the film.
Right.
And a lot of times you'll get something halfway finished, and they'll kind of look at it and decide that it needs to be longer or needs to have more, detail on it or something. But in this case, there were never any changes. They literally just gave us the drawings, and we gave them a 1/20th scale Titanic model.
Right. So me and you met at Stetson Visual Services, Inc. But you've worked at a lot of places in LA before moving up to Portland. Rattle off some like global.
I worked at a lot of things at Digital Domain. Apollo 13 and Titanic were both at Digital Domain. I worked at Patrick Totopoulos Studios on iRobot and a couple of the Underworld movies, making Fangs, and I actually ended up in some of their behind-the-scenes footage. And,
I wished you'd have gotten me an air nozzle from Pat. That would have been great.
We'll have to look into it. Maybe someone's still got one.
I have a collection of those, which you can see on the website eventually. I'll put a picture of those up. So a few years back, you came up to Portland and joined a lot of us from LA already working here for Leica Studios and doing stop motion animation. How was that transition coming up to Portland to work at Leica?
It was, the transition coming up to Portland was surprisingly easy. In addition to the fact that I probably knew about 15 people working there, from previous jobs, but just the culture and the feel of the model shop, and just the vibe and the jargon for, what different things are called, different tools and different materials, and just the way, the tool room is laid out with different drawers for strips of styrene and brass rod and stuff like that. It just, within a couple of hours of working there, it felt like I'd been working there for years.
I found it interesting because so much of what we did down in Los Angeles was mimicking or recreating stuff photorealistic.
Yeah.
And so if we made a 747, it had to look like a 747.
And there was no aging on a 747. There aren't
or
broken off panels or grease dripping out of the bolt holes.
Or too much of it, right?
Yeah.
And even doing science fiction or anything like that down in Los Angeles, it was it always ended up being very photorealistic, more reality.
Well, very straight lines, sort of industrial models.
Right.
And
we got up here to Leica, and I think I know some of the people from LA who'd been steeped in realism for years and years. They struggled the first couple of years to get, because anybody who's seen Paranorman or Box Trolls or Kubo, things like that from Leica, know that it comes with a real heavy style, very artistic, very, very creative. And that was a bit of a struggle early on to match those styles that they wanted out of us.
Yeah, I didn't really have too much of a problem with that. In fact, I was I think in a way it was a lot easier, because when you're making something that's photorealistic, all your measurements have to be perfect. All the rivets have to be perfectly symmetrical in a line. And, if you're making a line of rivets down a panel on a spaceship, and you get to the end and you're half a rivet off, you're kind of screwed. Whereas doing things for Leica, every show has its own style, but there's usually, they just like things to be a little bit off kilter and a little bit wonky. And so the fact that they're really usually aren't any straight lines in their films, or at least things aren't usually symmetrical.
Right.
There's just a lot more leeway where instead of looking at a blueprint, you're just kind of glancing at a sketch.
So you see that as
winging it.
Advantageous. You see it as wiggle room. You see it as
definitely.
as
For me, it wasn't having to break myself out of my rigid linear approach to things. For me, it was just it covers your mistakes, and it just makes it easy. And if you make something that's, they decide they want an inch longer, than the original, you made a chair or something, it's easy to just run it through the bandsaw and glue a chunk of plastic into the gap and sand it down and make it, longer.
Do you like working on stop motion animation?
Oh yeah, I have to say, in fact, I just put up some photos on Facebook a couple nights ago, and one of the comments I made in it was that The Box Trolls was probably the most fun film I've ever worked on, because it was set in Victorian England, sort of at the cusp of the Edwardian era, where technology was just starting to come in, and since it was a fantasy, the sort of 1800s technology ended up being very steampunk.
Right.
And so you had all of this opulence and ornamentation of the Victorian era combining with these weird sort of prototype steam-powered vehicles, and it ended up just being, every inch of every shot was just covered with detail. And that's something that it dawned on me pretty quickly in the course of that film, that the Box Trolls had more miniature effect shots in it than really any other film ever made in history. And, when you think about Blade Runner or Star Wars or the films we grew up on that really established miniature effects as a look, Star Wars, the original film maybe had 5 or 10 minutes of miniature effects, and the rest was live action.
Right.
And, Blade Runner, the same thing. Most of the stuff was shot on sets, and there's occasional shot of a flying car. But the Box Trolls, every single frame of the film was a miniature shot, and there were so many miniatures in each shot, and just things moving around in the background, that it was actually, it took a long time for the animators just to produce, a frame of footage, because each time they would, take a shot, they weren't just moving a puppet, a quarter of an inch, but machines and gears and things moving around in the background. They would have to go up there and tweak each gear, a 16th of a turn.
I'm real proud of that movie also, having worked on it, but also it was one of the hardest movies I've ever worked on in the industry.
Yeah.
But it shows, it's all up on screen.
Well, I think that's the difference between being in a supervisory capacity or just getting to be a fabricator. I've never really had any interest of being in charge of things, because then you don't get to make things. You're just
true. George is
keeping
alluding
track
to the
of
fact
other
that I
people.
was in charge of the model shop for the Box Trolls, and I didn't do very much actual building in those 18 months. I was running around making sure everybody else was building, but still, that was a beautiful movie.
Well, I remember you came in on your own time.
Yeah, I would come in towards the end when I realized everything was running out and I hadn't really built anything. I came in on a couple of Saturdays and Sundays and built the camera and tripod that's in the market, and a few other little things like that, a couple of signs here and there, but not nearly as much as I would have liked to.
Yeah, but you assigned the coolest builds to yourself.
Well, the camera was cool, but I think the coolest thing in that movie was the Snatcher Mobile, and that was headed up by Keith McQueen and a bunch of others, Kobe and guys in rigging and CNC. But I think that is a beautiful prop, and it had over 30 points of things on it that could animate articulation, and there was too many that the animators decided amongst themselves to do about 10 or 12 points of animation and let the rest slide, because there's just so much on that truck that you could animate. It's really an awesome prop.
Yeah, the only thing I actually built on the Snatcher exterminator truck was there's a seat for the villain that he sits on the top of the truck, and he's got a little Victrola, and next to that there's a little tea table with a teapot and a sugar bowl and a couple of cups. And I built the top half of this tea table because it had some pretty fine details as far as the little banisters on a little railing to keep the teacups from falling off. But the top of the tea table was made out of a sheet of steel, and then each of the teacups in the teapot had these really high-powered magnets built into them so that they wouldn't fall off accidentally, but they could be moved around by the animators so that in each frame they could kind of have them bouncing and vibrating around to show the fact that the truck was, careening down the street and all of this stuff on there wasn't actually nailed down, that it would kind of move. So
yeah, that truck was really brilliant. So you're enjoying stop motion now. You're probably going to stick with it if you stay in Portland. It looks like you're gonna, because I know you're a landowner now, so you've got a home up here. So you're digging in. But you did a little bit of stop motion, or at least a stop motion model before you got to Portland down in LA, and that was something you did for Starship Troopers.
Oh yeah, Starship Troopers was the only show I ever have worked on as an animator, or assistant animator. Starship Troopers was made, I think we started working on that in 1997. And at that point, the film industry was going through kind of a weird shift. Computer effects were really starting to come in at that point, but they were still using miniature effects for, like spaceships and buildings and the larger things. And the computers were used more for physics type of things like fire and water and explosions and things that were still hard to fake with animation. But what had happened was a couple years before that, there were a couple of really big hit sort of effects movies, Independence Day and Twister. And they kind of changed the paradigm, as Hollywood likes to say, because for years before that, all of the big blockbuster films had starred Arnold Schwarzenegger or Bruce Willis, right. These big action stars that were charging $20 or $30 million a film,
right.
Which the studios hated, having to spend that kind of money for the actor. And so they had made what were considered lower budget films. Twister and Independence Day did not have an all-star cast. I mean, Will Smith was not really Will Smith yet when he was in Independence Day. Right. He was just one of this ensemble cast. And so since there weren't any big stars, no one was getting probably even $1 million to be in it. But they spent some money on special effects, and the movies were huge hits. So suddenly Hollywood went, hey, we don't need to spend all this money on Bruce Willis. We'll get a bunch of, B-list actors. I mean, well, not to insult them, but up and coming, yes. Yeah. Up and coming actors, right. And we'll spend all the money on special effects. Then we don't have to pay them a big royalty, and we'll have these big blockbusters. So all that kind of came to a head in '97, where basically there were so many big budget blockbuster movies without, A-list blockbuster stars in them. And all these movies came out that same summer. And so you had Batman 4, Alien 4, two Volcano movies, right. Volcano and Dante's Peak, Armageddon, Titanic, and basically you had one huge blockbuster at least coming out every weekend for the entire summer.
I remember that.
And the usual plan for a blockbuster was you have a big opening weekend, but then you make almost that much the next weekend, and you keep making money off of your blockbuster all summer. And here all of these films were cannibalizing each other's market. And, honestly, with the exception of Titanic, I mean, none of them really did well financially. Most of them were horrible flops because also most of them weren't that good. They were kind of made in a hurry, and they didn't really have much of a story.
Now get back to the stop mo.
Well, so what had happened was...
Starship Troopers.
Sorry, yes, I digress. So
as you do.
Around that time, there were so many big action movies being made, and they all were trying to use as much of this computer animation, this new thing called CG. And it got where basically every computer that could do rendering for computer animation was not only booked for the next year, even the ones that hadn't been made yet had been pre-sold to special effects companies. So Sony's Imageworks, which was their digital department, came to their model shop, which was at the time was called Sony Thunderstone, and basically came in with the storyboards and said, which of these shots could be done somehow other than with CG? Because we did the math, and with the rendering time it's taking, we're not going to have the computer effects done in time for the release of the film.
Sheer time physical.
So one of the shots that the model shop decided they could do was the destruction sequence for when the Roger Young spaceship, which is the main sort of battleship in Starship Troopers, it gets blasted by a big wad of nuclear bug juice that is shot up into space from the planet, and it blasts a hole through the midships of the Roger Young, and it catches fire and slowly starts melting and breaking apart. And that was one of the scenes that they decided to do with stop motion. So since I had been one of the model makers working on it at the time, and I had a little bit of experience with cable controls and so forth, they had me design a system which was basically, there were about 20 interior floors on the inside of the ship that you could see when you look through this big hole. And I made it where the last couple inches of each floor was actually made out of 2 sheets of aluminum foil sandwiched together with some little sort of wires and photo etched brass details kind of capping the burnt edges of the floor. And each of these floors had 3 or 4 cables built into it that all ran back to the back of the ship, where there was this rack of brass rods with guitar tuning pegs hooked to them. And so you could turn the guitar peg, the same things you would use, on a guitar to tighten the guitar strings.
Right.
But in this case, they would turn these brass tubes, and each tube would pull in 3 or 4 wires, causing these floors to slowly collapse. So by twisting each guitar tuning peg, and there were probably about 12 or 15 of them, each guitar tuning peg, you would twist it, a quarter of a turn, and it would cause one of these floors to collapse by about 1/8 of an inch.
Right.
And so that was built into the 2 halves of the ship model, which were mounted on a motion control rig, so that each frame of the shot, I would climb up onto the model and twist all these pegs to make the floors slowly collapse. And then the model mover would move the 2 halves of the model ship, which the model was actually 18 feet long. Wow. So it was a big model. And the 2 halves of it would slide, a quarter inch apart.
Sure.
And so it was, I think it was about a 5-second destruction sequence, and it would usually take about 2 hours to animate, which is pretty fast for stop motion animation. Yeah. Because really, the only thing we were moving were these floors and a few other little details.
So you were actually twisting the controls.
I had to climb up on a ladder and get up on the model and twist these tuning pegs.
So and you could argue you are an animator.
I am a stop motion animator on a major motion picture, and it was actually quite a learning experience. What little I know about stop motion, as far as when you make a move, you want to start it out, moving, an 1/8 of a turn for the first couple of frames, and then you speed up to a 1/4 of a turn and then a 1/2 a turn. Because if you look at really old stop motion films where the characters seem very jerky, it's because, when you move your arm doesn't start out moving fast. Right. It starts moving a little bit, and then it speeds up, and then it slows down as you sort of get to the end of the move.
Right.
And but this was the kind of stuff I was learning from the 2 animators I was assisting. And one of them was a guy named Pete Kleino, who was this old school, he looked like those old pictures you'd see of Walt Disney, where he wore these long sleeve white dress shirts and the pleated chino pants.
Right.
And he was just this very clean cut, classy kind of old school guy. And he had been doing stop motion forever. He'd actually worked on this animated series, which I watched as a kid, but a lot of people haven't heard of today. But it was called Gumby, and it was about this weird little green guy that lived in a world of animated toys, and he had a talking horse, and but he had worked on Gumby, so that's one of the fun things about working in Hollywood, is that you frequently will end up working with someone that worked on a show that you
Right.
loved as a kid.
Right, or connections to Hollywood elite like Adam Gelbart and
Yeah.
Patrick Denver.
Yeah. A lot of big Hollywood stars from the old days, their kids, I guess the ones that don't become producers or actors themselves, a lot of their kids seem to find their way into special effects because it's a fun job, and if you're already living in LA anyway, it's easy to break into.
So now you just got done doing a stint at Leica Studios, and you're looking around for the next thing. But I mean, Leica Studios model shop was nice. Let's talk a little bit.
Leica's one of the best model shops I've ever worked in.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Certainly the cleanest and
safest,
best ventilated
yes.
I've worked, with the possible exception of Disney.
Talk about a couple of the shops you and I have worked at when we were starting out, just how bare bones and cash poor they were.
Well, it's interesting. When I first got to LA, I'd only really heard of big, special effects companies like ILM, and when I first got to LA, it was just at the point that the special effects industry was starting to move out of the studio system and into just small industrial spaces and even people's garages. Because
literally.
I've worked on many famous films and TV shows where the prop maker was just subcontracting out from the show, and he was working in his garage in North Hollywood or
as we
Senior
did
Valley.
With me and you in my garage doing U571.
Yeah, we made some rubber guns. They were basically stunt guns. A lot of times when you'll see a big battle scene or a fight scene, or cowboys riding on a horse, the gun that's in their holster is usually a realistic casting of the actual gun that's made out of rubber, so that way if the guy falls off his horse and lands on his gun, it's not going to poke him. Or if guys are fighting over the rifle and the guy hits him in the head with it, they don't want to hit him with the real rifle because that would hurt. So they used the rubber gun. And we had made a bunch of realistic World War II Thompson submachine guns and M1 carbines for this scene. And as frequently as the case, we put a lot of detail into making these highly realistic rubber copies of these guns. And in the final shot in the film where these American sailors sneak up and take over a German submarine, they might as well just have been holding broomsticks painted black in their hands, because you could barely see anything. The scuffle happened so quickly and it was so darkly lit. But that's why we do it. You never know where the camera's going to be and how closely they're going to film something. So
we ended up with some nice castings on our wall and the checks cleared. So
yeah, those are among my favorite souvenirs I've gotten over the years from movies.
But we've worked in some shops that are pretty rough. I remember, I won't name the shop, but my desk for the first month I was there was a piece of 3/4 ply on top of a garbage can, and my chair was an apple box.
Yeah, well, I've even worked on films recently, not at Leica, and again, major film companies that don't have a registered spray painting booth that's approved by the air quality management company, and they say, oh, if you need to paint something, just go outside.
In the alley.
And you walk out into the alley with a can of spray paint and your respirator, and then you're just spraying stuff, on a movie prop, a phaser or a tricorder, and you're just hoping the neighbors don't complain,
Totally. I've painted more miniatures and props for major motion pictures in the alleys of Los Angeles than not.
Yeah, the studios are kind of a misnomer in that regard. More and more stuff is just done independently.
So when we got started in mid-late 80s, we were seeing really the last vestiges of the old studio systems dying out. And we've come a long way since then with CG taking over. So what's your feeling of the state of the special effects and miniature industry now?
I think the one thing that has been constant in the special effects industry and the film industry in general for 100 years has been constant change.
Right.
And every few years, a new technology will come in And, going back to the time when they moved from silent films to talkies, or from, giant cameras that had to be on a platform in the studio to portable ones that they could take on horseback and film a Western, out in the desert. So things are always changing, and Hollywood is always moving. The film industry started out on the East Coast, and
That's
then
true. A lot of people don't know that.
Moved to Hollywood in the teens and 20s because Thomas Edison was threatening to sue anyone that used a movie camera because he said that he had invented it, and therefore he owned the motion picture. And then, in the 30s or the late 20s even, they started getting talkies. And then they started getting better talkies where they didn't have to just crowd around the microphone.
And then color.
Yeah, color and CinemaScope and VistaVision and 3D. And then, I consider sort of the golden age of special effects to be the 70s when sci-fi became popular and they started making a lot of miniature futuristic cities like Logan's Run. And
big tentpole blockbuster movies became like a norm.
Yeah, Jaws was the first one that really changed that.
I remember when The Abyss came out, and everybody remembers the water tentacle that Cameron had them do CGI. And I remember Mark Stetson. He's a legend in our part of the industry.
Yeah, a mentor to us.
A mentor to us, too. And he came through the shop and said, "Boys, it's time for you to learn the computer." And that was, what, 1990, 91? When
that's probably 89.
89, 90. And here I am, 2018. I still can't get it in my head that I should learn the computer, but that's fine.
Yeah, it's... I've thought about that lots of times, but I've never been good with computers or math or codes or anything like that. And I've just always been naturally comfortable and happy making things with my hands.
Me too.
If I was going to learn to use a computer, I wouldn't learn that to then stay in special effects and make $10 an hour as a rendering slave somewhere. I mean, I would learn Excel or
like we were talking
Microsoft Word.
Things constantly changing. Is all those people in the 90s and aughts that jumped ship from building physically, like Doug Miller and others, friends of ours, colleagues, that went into the computer, they kind of got screwed too when everything started to be outsourced to foreign countries, Asia and parts of Europe. And all those people now are struggling to find work as well.
Well, and a lot of them have come back to doing physical effects.
Yeah, like our buddy Doug Miller.
Because the thing about physical effects is that it's a lot harder to offshore than digital stuff. I mean, digital stuff, you can send them a drawing and sort of an animatic of what you want the sequence to look like, and they can bang it out in a few weeks and send it to you. And if you're not happy, they can change it, and it's cheaper to have it done someplace else. Whereas physical props, it's something that, I don't know, there's just something tactile about it where they want to have their hands on it and they want to see it being made. And I actually worked on a film in 2009. I was working at Legacy, which used to be Stan Winston's company. And after Stan died, they named it Legacy to honor his memory. But I was working there on Iron Man Part 2. And they were already... The 3D printing was already coming in at that point, and they were using a lot of 3D prints for the Iron Man suits. We were mainly just cleaning them up and finishing them.
Body shopping.
Yeah. But they took me off of that for a week to work on a film from India, which was called Robot, or at least that was the translation. The Indian name for it was something like Erythrean or something. But at the time, it was the most expensive film ever made on the continent of Asia. And now I think it's been eclipsed by another even more expensive film. But they obviously had no shortage of good computer animators in India. But there were some physical effects scenes of, when the robot's face comes off and you can see the wires and gears inside. And there was one, it was a Bollywood film, so there were several big dance production numbers. And there was one scene where the star of the film, who was sort of the Tom Cruise combined with the George Clooney of India, he's the biggest star in the country. he was dancing on stage with 20 copies of himself. So they wanted realistic masks of these for these other dancers to wear. And partway through the dance sequence, he reaches up and he has this sort of Terminator skeleton looking hand, and he pulls it off and then messes with it for a second and then sticks it back on. And they had me make the coupling for that hand.
Oh, cool.
So that, but I just thought it was ironic that when we're outsourcing so many technology jobs to India, that India wanted to do a really good job with their physical effects. And so they came to this legendary company in Hollywood to do it. And that ended up becoming kind of a big bragging point for them, that they were actually outsourcing something to America.
Sure.
And they ended up, the film wasn't even released theatrically in the United States. You could only get it on video. But they had a special screening just for our crew at a theater in Westwood. And it was like 3.5 hours long, and it was a really fun film. But the physical effects and props are something that they always need. Like even on Iron Man 2, all the scenes where Iron Man was fighting or flying around are computer generated.
Right.
But when the scenes where he takes off the helmet or where they're building the suit or working on it, they need the physical costume for the actor to be wearing or, moving around in.
Right.
So I think there's always going to be a demand for physical props. It's just that, they're not using them so much for, Taco Bell commercials and things like we used to use them for.
See, and that right there, I think, is the magic of our long-term friendship. Is I lean a little pessimistic, and you always lean a little optimistic.
Yeah, a little. People accuse me of being an optimist, whereas I've always considered myself more of an enthusiastic pessimist, where I just assume everything is going to suck. So I'm pleasantly surprised when it ends up kind of being decent. Yeah. Rather than assuming it's going to be great and then being destroyed when it's not as good as you expected.
And when people call me a cynic, I just say, no, I'm being pragmatic. So, all right. So you've had a pretty good career. It's had its ups and downs because this industry is like that. And it can be really difficult. What do your parents think of all this? Your parents are still with us, and what do they think of all this?
When I was about 27, I remember it was one of the darker periods in special effects, and everybody was out of work. And my father and I were camping, and he basically asked if I wanted to take over his jewelry business because he was getting older. And I appreciated the offer, but I told him that I didn't want to just, run a store for the rest of my life. Right. But I really like the constant change and variety and just the interaction with other film people and special effects people. I've thought about it before. In every shop I've worked with, I just meet so many interesting people, and they're people that love movies and they love Star Wars and they love, everybody has at least one or two or three hobbies on their spare time where they make their own jewelry or they make their own spaceship models or car models, or there's something creative that everyone's into. They make their own films. And I think about it, and even like pretty much every shop I've worked in, even the people that I didn't especially bond with or, end up staying in touch with after the show, if I'd known them in high school, they probably would have been one of my closest 4 or 5 friends, because we just have so much in common. Everybody there is always, ordering some new Star Wars collectible or something. Yeah. And when it comes in the mail, and everybody crowds around them to watch the box open and see what...
That's what I've liked over the years, is that we've just been exposed to so many creative people and so many unusual tools and techniques and materials.
Well, and pretty much everybody we work with, like I said, has some sort of hobby, or they're a fine artist or a painter, on their own time. And just the techniques that we're exposed to and the materials and the tools, are things that you would never learn all of that in art school or film school or engineering school, because we're always experimenting with something new to come up with a new shot or a new effect. and things you'd never think of, and you go, oh my God, this plastic is so perfect for this
right.
thing I'm going to do on this model car kit.
Yeah.
You know,
it's really interesting because people like you and again, Keith McQueen and others, obviously over in rigging and stuff, come from a world of metal. You're exposed to that early on, whereas I think my forte is more plastics because that's all I really had access to as a kid. And but you're right. I mean, and then there's these sculptors that come along that you're exposed to, young ones as well as the old veterans like Kent Melton. And it's just amazing to see what they can do with various forms of clay. And yeah, you're right. You'd never learn that at one art school. All the different techniques.
But even like, every kid pretty much that goes to public school, you work with clay when you're a kid because it's cheap and it's non-toxic and it's fun to squish it into dinosaurs and teacups and stuff. But what's interesting, like, if you became a ceramicist, you learn about, clay and firing it and stuff. But the things that we learn just about, sculpting something out of clay and then pouring, RTV rubber over it and making a mold, then you could make whatever that dinosaur or monster that you sculpted, you can cast that then in rubber or hard foam or hard plastic or concrete or whatever you wanted to do with it. And these things that, I probably learned more the first week working on a film than I did,
most
the whole time I was in college. Because just, I was learning to make molds and cast resin. And,
I learned so much about painting, just watching Ron Gress. Ron Gress he's a really awesome painter. He's an art director now. I'm not sure, he may even be art production designer now. But I worked with him for years when he was painting models. And I learned a lot from just observing the old timers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people we know, a lot of the people we work with are collectors of one form or another. And everybody's got their focus. What are some of the things you collect?
Well, like anyone with an addiction, I'm in denial about the fact that I'm a collector of any kind.
Your walls are full of stuff. Come on.
I have a fetish for miniature TVs. So whenever I'm at Goodwill or a garage sale or something, and I see the tiny, 4-inch transistor radio with a TV in it, I tend to buy those, and I've got probably 8 or 10 of those just sitting on a desk in my living room.
The TVs that were pre-Walkman.
Yeah.
Watchmen, I should say,
And I like antique technology, just for its look. But then I've also got a lot of movie props from projects I've worked on. And over the last few years, thanks to the wonders of the internet, pretty much any film that's ever existed, there are props for sale online somewhere. But it's not like it used to be, because now when you work on a film, they used to just throw everything in the trash at the end of it, and they didn't care if you took it. Because there was no way of auctioning it off unless you were really diligent and you had a booth at a sci-fi convention or something. Then you could sell stuff. But they didn't have eBay, so it was different. There was no reason for them to try to control where this stuff goes at the end of the show, because it's just going in the trash. And but now, you can find things from your favorite films, and there's something, Luke Skywalker's shoes, from one scene, and it's $30,000, on some auction website. And so I kind of had to make a cutoff for myself because occasionally I'll see something on a website that I just, oh my God, I should buy that, and it's only $100. But the rule I made with myself is that I can only buy something if it's from a film I worked on. So
that's good.
I've got a couple of things over the years that I picked up cheap that were from a film I worked on. I'm
slowly starting to get rid of stuff. I've decided I'm only collecting stuff from Blade Runner, and that's going to be about it. So I'm going to be selling stuff. Keep your eyes open.
Yeah, well, I hope you'll give us first shot at it.
So what's the next thing for you now that me and you are both cut free from Leica Studios?
Well, to quote the late Tom Petty, the future is wide open.
It really is.
There's, it seems like...
It's kind of scary.
Leica being in Portland, even though they're on hiatus right now, it's sort of like the sunken ship that the coral reef grows on. Not to say it's a sunken ship, but it is the mass that has caused this ecosystem of animators and painters and model builders to flock to Portland over the last 10 years or so.
It really is.
And, you know, a lot of people end up not being hired back for the next project or will leave to work on their own projects. But it's led to this, I think, per capita, there are probably more professional film animators in the city of Portland than any other place in the world.
I think so.
And so now other companies have relocated here recently. Shadow Machine, they did is Robot Chicken?
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah, Animation House from LA. They've opened a branch up here that's now expanded, and it looks like their company is basically relocating to Portland.
Right.
Because it's cheaper to live here than LA, and there's a lot of talented people looking for work.
If you've got money and you want to get into stop mo, please come to Portland. There's House Special, another stop motion studio. There's Bent Image Labs. There's Shadow Animation or Shadow Machine that I think would talk to you if you had serious money.
Mike Bossert Studio.
Sure, I will make a stop motion movie for you if you have the cash. But we are today is a special day for me and you in that we have finished a movie. You came in late in the game and helped push a movie that I'd started 20 years ago over the finish line. And its title is Burning Highway, and we're very close to having it out to the public. What's your feelings about this endeavor?
Well, like almost every movie I've ever worked on, I fell in love with this movie from day one. I don't want to give away too many details about the story or the locations, but I has always seemed to be my story in life. At the last minute, a crew member had to drop out of the film, and so I ended up jumping on at the last minute and was just doing set construction and ended up being sort of a crowd wrangler for the actual production of the show.
Yeah,
but
it was much needed.
Over the years, as the film languished in post-production due to lack of money, I ended up coming on.
And occasionally lack of enthusiasm on my part.
I've sometimes been accused of having a contagious enthusiasm. And in this case, I really loved this film. It was shot in the desert on Route 66, and
on film, 16 millimeter.
On 16 millimeter film, it's a road movie. And there were just a lot of elements in it that really, really sort of touched my heart. And I've worked on a lot of independent films over the years, and very few have been released or become successful. But this one I'm very excited about. It's, like I said, it's been a long haul. I compare independent filmmaking to climbing Mount Everest. A lot of people think that once they reach the top of Mount Everest, it's sort of the same thing as when you finish shooting your film, because now you've finished the hardest part and it's all downhill and it's easy from there. But most people that die on Mount Everest actually die on the way back down when you're tired and you've run out of oxygen.
That's true.
And most independent films do not die halfway through the shoot. Yeah. They usually get everything in the can, and then as they're trying to edit it, they're out of money and they just lose steam, and it ends up languishing.
It was out of money. I put me and my wife in the hole. We had a fair amount of debt, and
under $1 million. It's like the number we like to say.
Yeah, sure. I'll go with that.
If any distributors ask how much the film cost,
right.
Just say under $1 million.
And so, for years after the movie was shot, I had to focus on paying off debt, like a student loan. It was like a learning experience. So anything else you want to say before we sign off?
Well, one thing was interesting. When we recently went on hiatus from Leica, I ended up getting a call from a fellow former Leican who had left a couple years previously to work on his own projects. And he called me out of the blue from Atlanta, of all places.
Right.
And I knew that there were some animated shows being shot in Atlanta, but I didn't realize the extent of it until he basically offered me a job there. And within a week, I flew out to Atlanta, and I was living with him and at one point 3 other guys in an Airbnb house
that they were covering.
Yeah, that the studio was paying for.
A bit of a frat house.
Yeah, it was kind of, I refer to it as the nerd frat. It was sort of like, what's the show? I'm blanking on it now. It's sort of like the Big Bang Theory, but without any girlfriends.
Right.
And yeah, it was a bunch of guys doing special effects during the day and then coming home and watching Star Trek at night. But it was a really good experience, and as ironic as it sounds, there are actually more feature films being shot in Georgia right now than in Hollywood.
Yeah, I'm done moving.
It's yeah.
I'm staying.
Well, it was definitely an interesting little safari for 3 months, and it's another puppet show. Ironically, Atlanta has a very historic and thriving puppet community, and they even have a Center for Puppetry Arts, which is a combination puppetry museum, and they have several theaters in the complex, and they teach puppetry classes for kids and puppet making. And so yeah, Atlanta is also a great place to locate if you want to make a puppet film.
Of all the places you could have talked about, all the things that you're going to end on Atlanta.
Yeah. Well, it was my most recent paying gig, so it's fresh in my mind.
Right.
But
and they keep threatening to hire you back for another one.
Yeah, and I guess that would be my my closing statement, the takeaway, which would be that, again, the film industry is constantly changing, and in this case, constantly moving. Right. So I thought this would be the last move I ever made from LA to Portland. But now it seems that there's work in Atlanta, so I'm kind of back in the freelance world, it seems like. And just like it's always been, it's like being, a migrant farm worker, but instead we're migrant film workers, and you end up having to go wherever the harvest is. And if there's a bad harvest in one town, you just you follow the Okies to the next town and hope that there's work there.
Oh, I can't do it. All right, so final thing. If people want to get a hold of you, how can they? Do you have a website or Facebook?
You can find me on Facebook.
George Willis.
I think I'm the only George Willis in Portland.
Yeah.
I actually just put up a bunch of photos. Cool. Since I'm now looking for work for the first time in 5 years, and had to fluff up my resume. So put up some pictures in the box.
Yeah, we're kind of rusty. I'm trying to figure out the resume thing again,
we've gotten sort of soft. We got used to this.
We're getting old.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. It's encouraging to me every time I work on a show, even at my age, and I see people working there that are older than me. Yeah. So I know that I've still got a few years left.
All right. Well, George, I appreciate you doing this with me, and thanks very much.
Bye.
Thanks, George. I hope you enjoyed getting to know an old industry vet, George Willis, a little bit better. I'll have a picture of me and George taken at the time of the interview on my website, michaelpossert.com. michaelpossert.com, along with some show notes from this episode. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for the next episode of Wow, You Made That. Thanks, everybody. See you again.